today, so I'm crossing my fingers that my dog doesn't bark and my son doesn't wake up in his room to ruin the audio in this video. Anyway, today we're going to be learning about a different river valley civilization. The last video and our last few lessons were about Mesopotamia in the Middle East. We're still kind of in that part of the world, or close to that part of the world, with this new river valley civilization. We're going to be studying the civilization of ancient Egypt, which was located in the Nile River Valley, close to the Middle East. Today, Egypt, where the civilization was located, is in northern Africa. So it's on a different continent, but kind of close to the region of the Middle East. Just like the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia, the Nile River in ancient Egypt was extremely important to their livelihood and their survival and their ability to create a great civilization. The Nile River had predictable flooding. Now, this is different from Mesopotamia. In Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would flood unpredictably so that the people in that civilization couldn't really prepare very well. They would always be caught off guard a little bit. In Egypt, this predictable flooding was a blessing to them. They knew every 6 months or so when the Nile was going to flood. In fact, I guess we'd call them scientists or engineers in ancient Egypt, were able to develop something called a Nilometer, which is basically a meter that measured the height of the Nile, and they could predict based on that reading on the Nilometer when it was going to flood, so they knew the perfect time to plant their crops, when to harvest it, and when the flooding came, it didn't affect them. They knew when it was going to happen, and they were prepared for it. Their crops weren't destroyed or ruined. Everything stayed according to that schedule. Obviously, like in all the other river valley civilizations we're going to study, this had a huge impact on their lives. The Nile River Valley was excellent for farming. It was very fertile. Anytime that river, the Nile River, would flood, eventually it would recede, and what it would leave behind is silt and minerals, things that left the soil extremely fertile, good for growing crops and agriculture. That amount of food and agriculture being grown was able to sustain a growing population. Obviously, there are other resources that a civilization can get from being near a river or on a river: drinking water, bathing water, fish for their diet. But also, like with other river valley civilizations, living near a river is good for trade. It's good for travel. People who lived in ancient Egypt, they built ships and boats that were able to cruise down the Nile. They were able to utilize this for trade, for travel. It made for a very successful civilization. So let's talk government. We know that that's another aspect of civilization that historians look for when we study these ancient cultures. In ancient Egypt, it was ruled by a king or a queen that was called a pharaoh. That's a very specific word to ancient Egypt. In Mesopotamia, we learned about the kings and how they had something called divine right. It was this idea that the right to rule, or their power to rule, came directly from the gods. This is true in ancient Egypt as well, but it goes a step further. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was seen to be a god on earth. So it wasn't just like they were getting their power from the gods, their power to rule. They were seen as gods themselves. Try arguing with that. Something interesting about ancient Egypt is that you wouldn't just have kings, you would also have queens sometimes too. We see in archaeological excavations and in some of the sources from the ancient period that there were female pharaohs. Kind of an unusual thing for the ancient time period. Now, speaking of gods, let's talk a little bit about the religion in ancient Egypt. In Egypt, they were polytheistic, which means they believed in more than one god. In fact, in ancient Egypt, there were over 2,000 gods, and they represented different parts of people's lives. For example, we have Hapi. Hapi was a god of the Nile, obviously the lifeblood of their civilization. Ra, the god Ra, which is the creator god, or sometimes called the sun god. Osiris, god of the underworld, meaning the place where people went after they died. Horus is a god of war and hunting. Seth, the god of chaos, violence, and storms. And these are just a few examples out of thousands. In the Nile River Valley, they had many other accomplishments as well. These may be familiar to you. Their calendar system, right? They were intelligent enough to study astronomy and the solar cycles, and they had a calendar that was based on those solar cycles. A lot of this also tied into their ability to predict when the Nile was going to flood too. They were intelligent enough to make these observations and record them and be able to base their life around them on a calendar. Are you a fan of math? Ancient Egyptians are important to the study of mathematics. The subject of geometry is something that develops in ancient Egypt. So when you take geometry class, you can say, thank you, ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians had a system of writing as well. We call this writing hieroglyphics. They literally look like little pictures, almost like little emojis from the past. And these little pictures represented words or sounds, like parts of words. And for a long time, we didn't understand what those hieroglyphics meant. We knew that it was their language, their written language, but we didn't understand what they represented. That is, until the discovery of something called the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is literally a stone tablet. An ancient letter was written in 3 different languages. It might have been Greek and in hieroglyphics and another language as well. And because we know the Greek language and this other language, we were able to use those to interpret the hieroglyphics that were also included on this letter. It's like it was translated 3 different times. So we used what we knew in order to translate the hieroglyphics, and from there it was off and running. So ancient Egyptians used hieroglyphics as their system of writing. They also developed an ancient type of paper called papyrus. I have an example of this hanging in class. They used reeds. There was a whole process that they used to clean and dry and flatten these reeds to make them into paper, almost like parchment paper. That's an accomplishment. You can see this ancient writing, these hieroglyphics on papyrus from the time, or carved into stone temples and pyramids. Speaking of pyramids, another important accomplishment of the ancient Egyptians was their architecture. You've probably seen pictures of the pyramids. It is one of the wonders of the ancient world. You can still visit them today in Egypt if you went on a trip there. Also the Sphinx, that's what we call the Sphinx today. These are things that were built during the time of ancient Egypt. Very impressive. It takes a lot of organization, a lot of manpower and technology to be able to do this. In a way, that's another similarity with ancient Mesopotamia. In ancient Mesopotamia, we have ziggurats, which we know were, or at least we think, were involved with the religious worship of the time in Mesopotamia. We have pyramids, which we think were tombs of ancient kings, right? If you were very wealthy, like a king, for example, you would have a pyramid built for you where your body would lay after you died and you went to the underworld. In fact, inside these pyramids, we find a lot of artifacts from the life of the person who was buried there. We also have mummification in ancient Egypt. Their process that they developed for mummifying or preserving a body after it had died was very impressive and different from other cultures. Even though other cultures did have their forms of mummification, it's very different in ancient Egypt, and we have detailed records of how they did it. I'm going to let you guys research that for your assignment in class, if that's something that interests you. There's a whole lot more to be said about ancient Egypt, but I don't want to cram it into this video and make it any longer than it has to be. So we'll see you next time in the next video lesson.